Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today is the third video I am doing in honor of this year's Native American Heritage Month. The subject of today's video is the Mogollon culture in the American Southwest. Now, right off the bat, uh, as I always like to point out, whenever those of us in the modern world hear the names of geographic regions or nations uh, in things such as that, for example, say the UK, China, or in this case, the Southwest, we always tend to think of them as we know them as they are now. For example, when we hear the word or the phrase the Southwest or the American Southwest, those of us in the modern world tend to think of um, the region of the United States that consists of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, and at least some part of Texas and part of Oklahoma. Um, Mainly this westernmost region of Texas and Oklahoma. But regardless, we tend to think of this area here. Now, of course, the American Southwest, in terms of geography, has been this way uh, basically the entire time it's existed over the course of millions of years or tens of thousands of years, if you will. But the political boundaries have not. Uh, you know, the Southwest has not always had the political boundaries of the states of, say, California, Nevada, Utah, etc. Now, of course, it's not an incorrect view to think of this region, the American Southwest, uh, as it is here on these maps. After all, they've looked this way for around 150-ish years or so, 150-ish years or so. So, of course, there's literally no one alive who, who knows them any other way. But this is not the full picture. This region only took on the political borders of these states after a long series of processes, events, and catalysts. So, in order to better understand how the Southwest took on its political boundaries, and in order to understand the broader history of the American Southwest as a whole, we need to go back a little further in time to get a better look at this bigger picture and this broader history. All right, so with that, we're going to move into the bulk of the video on the Mogollon culture. Starting with the early Pithouse period, which lasted roughly between 200 and 550 CE. And this is the period of time that the Mogollon culture would begin to develop in the Southwest. During this period, Mogollon communities lived on hilltops in round subterranean dwellings known as pit houses. Here is one of the hilltops that they might have lived on during this period of time, and here is one of the sort of round, ovoid, sometimes circular pit houses that they would have lived in. During this time, Mogollon communities were primarily hunter-gatherers. They did practice some minor agriculture, but by and large, they were still primarily hunter-gatherers. During this period, the primary tool used for hunting in the Southwest was the atlot. To be clear, the bow and arrow had been introduced during this time, around 100 to 400 CE, but it had not been completely adopted. The archaeological record shows that during this period of time, the primary hunting tool was most certainly still the atlot. And we can see some examples of this, including rare, very rare, surviving examples of otlot paddles in the archaeological record from the basket maker culture just a little bit north of the early pit house culture. And the reason this is rare is because most outlets were made, outlet paddles were made out of wood, and wood of course, does not survive very well in the archaeological record. And here's a modern reconstruction of one of those outlet paddles, based on a specimen from the White Dog Cave archaeological site. And here's an ethnographic outlet used for dunk cutting that was collected, and it has similar characteristics to late basket maker, and even a little further south, Aztec, or more properly Nahuatl and Mexica outlets. And the types, and we can tell that these tools were used by the types of PPKs, or projectile points. Projectile point knives is really the full name of PPK. So, really projectile points that have been found in the archaeological record, which, as discussed in the previous video on the Middle Woodland period in the North American Southeast, outlet points for outlet darts tend to be medium sized and round and sort of bulky. And you can see that here. And here's a comparison of outlet darts here with their projectile points versus arrow points. And you can see very much arrow points are much smaller and not quite as bulky as outlet points. And here's some more examples of outlet points and arrow points here. During the early pit house phase, Mogollon pottery was primarily plain brown or red slipped. Then we move to the next section, the late pit house period, which lasted between 550 and 1000 CE. During the late pit house period, Mogollon communities would begin living in rectangular pit houses located on terraces at lower elevations near major drainage areas. And also during this period of time, the population would begin to increase and larger villages would begin to develop. Here's an example of one of those rectangular pit houses that began to develop in this period. And here's one of the drainage areas next to terraces that the Mogollon communities would have been living in, or likely would have been living in or near during this period of time. During the late pit house period, Mogollon communities would begin to increasingly use agriculture based around crops such as corn, though they would also still be in large part hunter-gatherers, though not quite as much as in the preceding early pit house period. And you can see that here in this picture. And yes, as you can see here, the earlier picture talking about hunter-gatherers was a snip of this picture. And I snipped that out because while there is corn agriculture in the picture, this individual here is a prime example of what a hunter-gatherer still would have looked like in the early pit house period. During the late pit house period, the bow and arrow would I don't want to say necessarily completely replace, but would largely replace the outlet as the primary hunting tool in the Southwest. And this is archaeological evidence for this is discussed in the archaeological research of archaeologists such as John H. Blitz in his paper titled Adoption of the Bow in Prehistoric North America, published in the journal North American Archaeologist in 1988, where in it he discusses when the bow and arrow would have replaced the outlet during the Basket Maker 3 period. Again, that's a little bit further north and more associated with the ancestral Puebloan culture, uh, but would have been contemporary with the late Pithouse culture. Uh, and as you can see, this would have happened sometime between 575 and 750 CE. Again, right in the sort of cultural height of the late Pithouse period and late Pithouse culture of the Mogollon communities. Archaeological evidence also shows some degree of increase in inter-community conflict with the introduction of the bow and arrow in the Southwest. I use the phrase inter-community conflict for a very specific reason instead of warfare, but I will get into that in just a minute. But evidence for this intercommunity warfare at the introduction of the bow is discussed in the archaeological research of archaeologists such as Paul F. Reed and Phil R. Gieb in their article, their academic article titled "Sedentism, Social Change, Warfare, and the Bow in the Ancient Pueblo Southwest," published in the journal Evolutionary Anthropology in 2013. And in this paper, they take a look at the archaeological evidence for example, the earliest use of the bow, as well as the latest use of the outlet. They look at, they compare and contrast outlet points versus arrow points, as you can see here. Also, as you can see here in this picture. And when comparing this as well as the archaeological evidence, Reed and Gieb, for one thing, they point out that earlier hypotheses have stated that with the introduction of the bow and arrow, warfare increased within the Southwest. However, they take issue with this and go on to state that really there is no real evidence for this. I mean, there are unmistakable signs of warfare, but there's no real evidence for an increase of this warfare. Instead, what they point out is that the data shows a significant lag of warfare, with warfare and conflict not really beginning to be on the rise until well after the introduction of the bow and arrow, which again, the introduction of the bow and arrow to the Southwest happened between 100 and 400 CE, a little bit earlier than the late Pithouse period. Now, of course, the 600s, 700s does fall in line with the late Pithouse period itself, but they argue that this is fits within more with a separate theory known as the social coercion theory, where essentially different communities and groups would have minimal warfare and conflict for, again, social coercion between different communities, essentially to coerce and perhaps get like prestige goods or tribute or what have you, and things such as that, which does still fall within warfare, but again, it's not quite as widespread as warfare, so therefore inter-community conflict and, as they put it, social coercion more fits this, what the archaeological evidence shows. During the late Pithouse period, Mogollon red on brown pottery would be developed, specifically being developed between 650 and 750 CE. Now this brings us to our next section, the Classic Mimbres period, which lasted between roughly 1000 to 1200 CE. During this period, Mogollon communities would begin dwelling in above-ground square pueblos. Shared forms, including architectural features identifiable among the Mogollon, the ancestral Puebloans, and the Hohokam indicate interaction between all three cultural groups. And you can see some examples of that here, of these Pueblos here, and also here. In addition to that, sites like Gila cliff dwellings and Kinishiba show the influence of Puebloan architectural features. Again, supporting, again, showing evidence that there was certainly some degree of contact between the three primary cultural groups of the American Southwest during this period of time. Also, during the Classic Mimbres period, the population would continue to increase, leading to the establishment of large villages such as Paquime, located in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, which had a population of between 2,500 and 10,000 inhabitants. This is debated, and this could, of course, could have depended on cycles of migration and also people who were coming for trade and such. But somewhere in between this number, 2,500, 10,000 is what likely would have been the population for Paquime. I would argue perhaps somewhere in between, maybe 5,000 or a little more, and then the 10,000 inhabitants, like, happening when different trading groups came to Paquime. But regardless, it was somewhere between these numbers here. And Paquime lasted, had its height as a cultural center between 1130 and 1350 CE. Furthermore, Paquime shows mixes of both Southwestern style architecture in the eastern half of the city and Mesoamerican architecture in the western half of the city. Examples of Southwestern architecture at Paquime includes T-shaped doorways indicative of Puebloan cultures, including the Mogollon, ancestral Puebloans, and the Hohokam, and blocked Pueblo apartment complexes. And then Mesoamerican architecture at Paquime includes the Serpent Mound and the Serpent House, the Mound of the Bird, the Mound of Heroes, an eye-shaped ball court, and an associated temple, a temple associated with the eye-shaped ball court, and another mound known as the Mound of Offerings, all of which are very clear Mesoamerican style structures. And you can see on this picture here all of those structures that I just mentioned, like say the eye-shaped ball court and the Mound of the Serpent. Also, during the Classic Mimbres period, large ceremonial pits, often called great kivas, would begin to appear, specifically beginning to appear sometime around 850 CE. And during the Classic Mimbres period, Mogollon societies would completely adopt agriculture. And the Mogollon culture would spread throughout southern New Mexico, Arizona, northern Sonora and Chihuahua, Mexico, and western Texas. All right, now this brings us to our next section, Mogollon society. So, what did the Mogollon social structures look like? Well, Mogollon society was largely egalitarian. Villages and towns seem to have been corporate entities comprised of individual families. These included extended family households comprised of 6 to 15 rooms that would incorporate 3 or more individual habitation rooms. Each extended family seems to have controlled a corporate kiva. And archaeological evidence shows exotic goods being distributed relatively equally and consistently between room blocks and family groups, which supports the Mogollon society as being egalitarian and relatively free of large scale social inequality. And here's the source I got that information from. Now we need to look at Mogollon subsistence. So the Mogollon culture in the Southwest and most Southwestern cultures, including the Hohokam and the ancestral Puebloans, hunted animals such as deer, pronghorn, jackrabbit, and beaver. And this is evidenced by a number of archaeological assemblages that bear large numbers of faunal remains, as you can see here in this table here and here. And then also, Mogollon communities would farm crops such as corns, beans, squash, and agave. And Mogollon communities would also harvest wild plant foods such as pine nuts, also known as pinyon seeds, walnuts, prickly pear, and wild tomatoes. Now we go on to the next section, Mogollon art. So, as the title of this video suggests, the Mogollon culture is most well known for its beautiful pottery that was produced, some of which I've already talked about in a little bit earlier in the video. But really, the most famous pottery type produced by the Mogollon culture during their cultural height is a pottery type known as Mimbres pottery. And is well known for its black and white designs and its beautiful, black and white structural designs, like black and white paint combined, and its various artistic designs and depictions within. Now, before I move on, I do have to put a caveat. There are a lot of pictorial examples of Mimbres pottery that have holes within the middle, often called kill holes. I'm not going to show any examples of those because Mimbres pottery with kill holes in them are very much associated with mortuary contexts and burials. And those are, one, culturally sensitive, and two, displaying them is highly disrespectful to the descendant communities, the descendant Native American communities of the Southwest, who have stated repeatedly that they do not want any archaeological objects that are associated with mortuary and burial contexts displayed. No, I will not elaborate on the burial or religious practices that go with those Mimbres pottery that are associated with mortuary and burial contexts. As a white man, that is not my place. That is the place of the descendant indigenous communities. And again, they have very much stated that they do not want those examples of pottery displayed. They are okay with ones that are not associated with mortuary context being displayed, though. So therefore, I will show the examples that I have. So with that in mind, here are some examples of Mimbres pottery. Those are very much pretty indicative of Mimbres pottery during the height of its production, with many of them having various intricate shape designs, some zigzags, some triangular shapes, etc. Some have depictions of individuals doing various activities, such as this individual fishing. Some have depictions of, for example, this one of a pregnant woman And again, some have the typical zigzag designs and geometric shapes. In addition to Mimbres pottery, pottery at other sites such as Pakime have their own distinct designs and shapes, oftentimes bearing a combination of Southwestern and Mesoamerican designs, which makes sense given that Pakime has a combination of Mesoamerican and Southwestern architectural features. And here are some examples of pottery from Pakime here and here, as well as here and here, with many pottery from Pakime being the shape of human individuals. And also, the Mogollon culture produced a wide breadth of petroglyphs and rock art, which you can see here and here, as well as here and here. Now we move on to the next section, the Mogollon trade networks. So the Mogollon and other Southwest cultures were most certainly part of a continent-wide trade network, with the Southwestern cultures trading basically with, to some degree, with the entirety of the North American continent. I mean, they would trade some objects such as pipestone and red ochre and such east to the eastern woodlands, and of course conch shells and other things would be traded back and forth. They would trade with groups to the north for various types of shells and other objects such as steatite and chert. But by far the most well-known and what seems to be the most utilized trade network for the Southwestern cultures, such as the Mogollon, would be the trade between the Southwest and Mesoamerica. And there were a variety of trade goods that were valued and imported from Mesoamerica. For example, archaeology shows evidence for the trade of cacao between Mesoamerican communities and Southwestern communities. In fact, jars, Pueblo jars used for the drinking of froth cacao have been found. And here's just an example of cacao beans, chocolate. Let's just go ahead and call it what it is. This is chocolate. The archaeological evidence for this trade of cacao between Mesoamerica and the Southwest is presented in the archaeological research of archaeologists such as Patricia L. Brown in their paper titled Ritual Drinks in the Pre-Hispanic U.S. Southwest and the Mexican Northwest, published in the journal PNAS in 2015. And in this journal, the Patricia L. Crown et al. Produced evidence that they found using chemical analyses of some of these Puebloan cacao drinking cups, examining a variety of Southwestern sites, which you can see here on this map here. And you can see some of the jars that they examined. And as you can see here, many of the jars that they examined were from Mimbres and Mogollon communities. They looked at and analyzed the percentage of caffeine and other similar chemicals within these vessels. Again, many of which were from Mimbres Mogollon communities. Here's another table showing some of the samples that they took from these vessels and the amount of caffeine and other similar chemicals. And here's another table of similar results from a different group here. And the results do show that there was some degree of use of cacao. In this graph here, the samples from the Mogollon Highlands in northern Chihuahua are on the right. And while yes, some of them show evidence for other uh, uh, stimulant plants uh, other than cacao. Um, Many of the sites do most certainly show evidence for the use of cacao, uh, as well as one site showing evidence for the use of all three types of or both types of stimulant drinks, cacao and ilex. And here's some more graphs showing again that percentage and evidence for the use of cacao in the Southwest. Mesoamerican cultures also traded scarlet macaws with Western cultures. Archaeological evidence for this trade is found in the archaeological research of archaeologists such as Darrell Creel and Charmian McCusick in their paper titled Prehistoric Macaws and Parrots in the Mimbres area, New Mexico, published in American Antiquity, the Journal American Antiquity in 1994. And in this paper, they present their research that they conducted at multiple Mimbres communities in southwestern New Mexico, as you can see here on this map. And in these excavations and as a result of their research, they found a large number of scarlet macaw remains within multiple different pit houses and Pueblo rooms, which you can see here on this table here and this table here, all happening during the late pit house and late pit house period and classic Mimbres period. And in addition to these macaw remains, they also found pottery and other artifacts with depictions of macaws on them. Further evidence for this trade of scarlet macaws between Mesoamerica and the Southwest is seen in the archaeological research of archaeologists such as Andrew D. Somerville, Ben A. Nelson, and Kelly J. Knudsen in their paper titled Isotopic Investigations of Pre-Hispanic Macaw Breeding in Northwest Mexico, published in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology in 2010. And in this paper, they specifically look at the city of Paquimé, which you can see here, as well as the distribution of scarlet macaws in Mesoamerica. And during their investigations, they not only found macaw burials at Paquimé, they found adobe pins that were used to hold and breed scarlet macaws. In fact, these adobe pins, specifically adobe pins from Plaza 3 through 12, is where most of the macaw burials were found. And they also found a cage entrance from plazas 3 through 12. And this is just a table showing the developmental stages of the scarlet macaw itself. More evidence for this trade of scarlet macaws between the Mesoamerica and the Southwest can be seen in the archaeological research of archaeologists Paul E. Menace, Michael E. Whalen, Jane H. Kelly, and Joe D. Stewart in their paper titled Prehistoric Macaw Breeding in the North American Southwest, published in American Antiquity in 1993. And in this paper, much like Somerville, Nelson, and Knudsen, they look at the macaw breeding pens within Paquimé, as well as other sites in Chihuahua. And in fact, they show examples of macaw nesting stones that they found, with this one being one that is broken in half. And then still more evidence for this scarlet macaw trade between the trade of scarlet macaws between Mesoamerica and the southwest can be seen in the archaeological research of Adam S. Watson et al. In their paper titled Early Procurement of Scarlet Macaws and the Emergence of Social Complexity in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, published in the journal PNAS in 2015. And in this paper, they specifically look at ancestral Puebloan communities, uh, such as Pueblo Bonito, where they find bundles of scarlet macaw feathers. Now, of course, this is not necessarily Mogollon, the Mogollon culture. This is the ancestral Puebloan culture. However, the ancestral Puebloan culture was located to the north of the Mogollon culture. So it's almost certainly uh, the case that the scarlet macaw feathers and trade passed through the Mogollon region before getting to the ancestral Puebloan region. Uh, in addition to this, Mogollon communities would also trade with Mesoamerican communities, as well as communities on the west coast for marine shells, such as bittersweet clam shells and dwarf olive shells. With the evidence for this being presented in the archaeological research of Deanna and Grimstead et al. In their paper titled Identifying the Origin of Southwestern Shell, a Geochemical Application to Mogollon Rim Archaeomollusks, published in the journal American Antiquity in 2013. Were in this paper, they present their archaeological research and excavations at the Silver Creek Archaeological Research Project, a site located south of the Little Colorado River and north of the Salt River. And at the site, Grimstead et al. Found a number of shell artifacts, including the shell pendant that you see here, where they would then conduct geochemical analysis on the shell artifacts to determine their place of origin. And you can see the sort of traditional range is of these mollusks and shells that would typically be found or might or the possible places of origin for these shells that would be typically found at Mogollon and other southwestern communities, with samples taken from both the California Pacific coast as well as the coast of western Mexico in the Gulf of California. And then they also examined and worked out using GIS the sort of distance that would be traveled, or the distance it would take to get to shell producing areas for this trade. And what they found is shown in this table here, was that most of the shells found at the site and in Mogollon communities seem to have come from the Gulf of California in along western Mexico. Some of them certainly did come from the Pacific coast of California, but by far most of them came from the Gulf of California, possibly via trade routes and procurements through Arizona and Sonora, as well as Pahimé. All right, now this brings us to our next section, the decline of the Mogollon culture. Starting with the post-Classic Mimbres period, which lasted between 1150 and 1200 CE. Now, very quick, you note that while this is the decline of the Mogollon culture, the post-Classic period is still when Pahimé, the city of Pahimé itself, was at its cultural height. So this is just a rough time span. It's not necessarily indicative of the entire Mogollon culture. During the post-Classic Mimbres period, possibly due to increasingly frequent droughts, overexploitation of food resources, increasing conflicts. Mogollon communities would gradually shift away from large population centers to small hamlets with more social flexibility and resources. And the evidence for this is presented, the archaeological evidence for this is presented in the archaeological research of Michelle Hegman, Margaret C. Nelson, and Susan M. Ruth in their paper titled Abandonment and Reorganization in the Mimbres region of the American Southwest, published in the journal American Anthropologist in 1998. And in this paper, they examined multiple archaeological sites in the southwestern southwestern New Mexico and northern Chihuahua and such uh, of the Mogollon culture and Mimbres region. And you can see some more of those sites that I examined here and here, as well as here. And at these sites, they noticed a shift to smaller dwellings and hamlets, with as noticed by smaller hearths and milling facilities, which you can see here, as well as shifting hearth forms, which you can see here, as well as a shifting relationship between the hearth and room size, as you can see here, as well as the shifting relationships between grinding facilities, the former grinding facilities, and room size of these Mimbres post-classic sites, and the relationship between grinding facilities and hearths from these post-classic Mimbres sites. After looking at all of these examples, the shifting hearth forms, milling forms, etc., as well as the shifting size of rooms and homes, Hegman, Nelson, and Ruth argue that there is certainly evidence for a gradual shift of Mimbres communities abandoning larger settlement patterns, with populations dispersing, and community and regional relations being redefined. And this may be due to networks and alliances expanding, as indicated by the presence of imported material and new technologies, as well as the mixing of previously discrete traditions, and therefore materially homogeneous classic Mimbres villages, indicative of a strong sense of community, were replaced by small hamlets with a higher degree of material diversity, which, combined with the evidence for high residential mobility, suggests that the communities within the Mogollon culture might have been defined at a broader and less restrictive level, i.e., people were very clearly looking for more personal or familial freedom than had previously been sought in the classic Mimbres period. At the same time, during the post-classic Mimbres period, non-local pottery would begin to increase in frequency, and Mimbres pottery would slowly decline until its production would completely cease. And this again is presented, the archaeological evidence for this is presented in the archaeological research of Michelle Hegman, Margaret C. Nelson, and Susan N. Ruth in their paper titled Abandonment and Reorganization in the Mimbres region of the American Southwest, published in the journal American Anthropologist in 1998. And as you can see here on this table here and here, there is most certainly an increase of non-local, non-Mimbres pottery within these sites during the post-classic period. Now this leads us to our next section, the late Pueblo period, which lasted roughly between 1200 and 1450 CE. Now again, you'll note that during this period of time, Pahime, the city of Pahime was still very much at its cultural height. As I said earlier, this is just a broad overview of the decline of the Mogollon culture and is not necessarily indicative of the entire Mogollon culture itself. Each site and region of the Mogollon culture um, had different reactions and different shifts in culture. The first part of the late Pueblo period that we're going to look at is a period that is called by a variety of different names, those being the Black Mountain phase, also known as the Animus phase, also known as the El Paso phase, which lasted roughly between 1880 or 1200 to 1300 CE. And this is a fairly simple cultural shift during this period. During this period, Mogollon communities would begin producing new types of pottery, such as plius, red incised pottery, and would begin to shift to the use of adobe architecture that is plaza oriented rather than dense apartment block oriented, corporate apartment block oriented, as had previously been seen in the Classic Mimbres period. Then we also, during this period of time, as the El Paso phase, was a different cultural phase that was happening, known both as the Cliff phase, also known as the Salado phase, which lasted roughly between 1250 or 1300 CE to 1450 CE. During the Cliff, also known as the Salado phase, migrants from the Mogollon culture, the ancestral Puebloan culture, and the Hohokam cultures would settle in the Tonto Basin. And upon arriving in the Tonto Basin, these groups would intermarry with each other, becoming the Salado culture. The Salado culture would build multiple settlements in the Tonto Basin, including cliff dwellings, as seen here and here, as well as here. Upon establishing these new communities, the Salado culture would develop new types of pottery, such as Salado redware, which you can see here. And as you can see, it very definitely has some continuations of Mogollon artistic traits within it. However, despite the development of this new community and its relative success, between 1350 and 1450 CE, the Southwest would become more arid and would also witness alternating floods and droughts, which would then lead communities in the Southwest to abandon smaller villages and begin reconsolidating into larger communities. All right, now this brings us to our last section, after the decline of the Mogollon culture. Well, for one thing, with the decline of the Mogollon culture, as well as the decline of its successor cultures, the El Paso phase and the Salado culture, the remnants of the Mogollon culture would intermarry with other southwestern cultures, forming new cultural groups such as the Hopi and the Zuni, sometime between 1450 and 1600 CE. In conjunction with the development of the new southwestern communities, such as the Hopi and the Zuni, as well as the gradual decline of the Mogollon culture, the Athabascan-speaking ancestors of the Apache and the Navajo would begin to migrate into the Southwest sometime between the 1200s and 1500s CE. And here's a map showing some of that migration and distribution here, as well as a map showing a similar map showing that migration and distribution here. And then after the collapse of the Mogollon culture, the development of new cultural groups in the Southwest, the Hopi and the Zuni, as well as the migration of new cultural groups, such as the Athabascan-speaking ancestors of the Apache and the Navajo, a new and far more destructive cultural group would arrive in the American Southwest, that being the Spanish Empire, which first arrived in the American Southwest when the conquistador Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and other conquistadors would begin the Spanish exploration, in reality conquest, uh, and eventual colonization of the American Southwest, with Coronado himself leading a military expedition into the Southwest between 1540 and 1542 CE. And here is a map of his expedition here. But the Spanish conquest of the Southwest is a subject for a different video, and really a subject that I've already discussed in some other videos, including my video on the Pueblo revolt against the Spanish Empire, which I will include in the iCard, along with my video on indigenous subsistence methods, both before and after European contact. All right, with that, that brings an end to our video. I hope you all enjoyed watching and learning about this fascinating civilization that arose in the American Southwest. If you would like me to cover any of the subjects I mentioned in this video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.